All right, Mary, you can start.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Birchville Penny Arts Center Book Club at the Center. Of course, we're virtual tonight. I'm so delighted that you're here, and it's going to be a great night as we welcome the author, Paul Cumbo. For those of you that are regulars and have been with us for many years, you may remember Paul when he came to visit us with his book, Boarding Pass. But tonight we're going to talk about wilderness therapy, and we're just delighted to have him. Before we get to see Paul, I'd like to introduce you to my coworker, Michaela Waros, who is going to explain to you how this evening is going to be managed. So, Michaela?
Hi, everyone. So during the night, while our facilitators are asking Paul questions, you can also ask questions to him as well, and using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. So if you just move your mouse, you'll see that pop up. Use the Q&A section, and then during the night, I will come in and ask those questions for you. And then you can also use the chat box to chat with everybody here. You'll also see that we are recording, but only the panelists on the screen are being recorded.
Thank you, Michaela. I'd like to just start to talk a little bit about our book club, which has been running at the Birchville Penny Arts Center for many years now. It started as a docent initiative. We began by reading the books that were read by Charles Birchfield to help us understand him and get into his own mindset. But then we very quickly pivoted to reading books written by our own extraordinary community. Supporting those authors in our community is our mission, just as we support the artists and the musicians. Tonight's event is going to be facilitated by one of those docents, Kate Sudant. And Kate has been a docent with us for many years, and we were trying to remember if this was her fourth or third book club facilitation. I'm not quite sure, but she always does a great job for us. So I'd like to introduce you to Kate Sudant.
Thank you, Mary, and welcome to all of you. My job here as a facilitator is really just to introduce you to the author, which I will begin now. So Paul Cumbo is a veteran educator with nearly 2 decades of experience teaching English at Jesuit high schools for boys. He coached rowing for 12 years, during which his crews earned multiple US and Canadian national championship titles. I should also mention the 2 schools he worked for were Georgetown Prep in Maryland, and he is currently at Canisius High School in Buffalo. During his time as a teacher and educator, he also served as a swimming coach, a retreat director, and a service learning coordinator. He's written 2 novels, as Mary mentioned before, Boarding Pass, which was, I think, more based on your Georgetown experience, but you can talk about that later, and Wilderness Therapy, which is not based on Canisius, I don't think, but it's relevant to all boys today. And a short fiction collection, and he also has written, many of you may have heard about this, Blue Doors, which is an institutional history of Canisius High School. I was excited to hear about that. I'm going to have to get that next. And his articles, he's written articles now. They've appeared at U.S. News and World Report, the Buffalo News, and Independent Ideas, a publication of the National Association of Independent Schools. As an editorial consultant and freelance writer, Paul's clients include professionals, small businesses, as well as some of the world's most prominent names in the corporate, academic, and nonprofit sectors. He also co-founded the Camino Institute, which offers immersive service-oriented retreats in the rural Dominican Republic. Paul was one of 5 brothers and is currently married with the father of 2 boys and 1 girl. So Paul lives near Buffalo, New York, and I hope we hear more about the Camino Institute and his relationship with an interest in young men and adolescent boys. So I will like to start this with a question, Paul. With your experience working with boys and their interior struggles, was this the reason, the subject, that adolescent boys is something you chose to write about?
It was. Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here. I think that an image that always comes to mind for me when I think about the interior lives of boys and young men is the Grand Canyon. And I like to bring that image to mind because it is such an accessible and familiar image to most people, whether or not they've actually been to the Grand Canyon or not. Most people are aware of it and can picture it. And if you look at the image of a Grand Canyon, what you'll see is a lot of striation. You'll see geologic diversity that has developed over the eons. There's great depth, there's great variety, and depending on the nature of the seasons and the light, the rocks look very different. And it's shaped and it's molded by very, very powerful forces. But sometimes those forces are very subtle and they take time to recognize and to understand. In my career working with young men, I have come to understand that their interior lives in many ways are like the river that carves a deep canyon. And there is a great deal of depth. There's a lot of complexity in the inner life of a boy's mind and heart, but it's below the surface. Oftentimes, unlike a mountain, it is down below, and it takes some time to get to those depths, to be able to discern what's going on in them. And so, yeah, my work with a lot of kids over the years has inspired me to have a powerful appreciation for the complexity and the depth that exists in their minds and hearts. And both of my novels are, I think, attempts to probe and explore that complexity and to bring it to the page in a way that runs contrary to the cultural message about boys, which is often that they're simplistic or reductive or monolithic in their thinking and in their feeling. So that was certainly an inspiration for the novel. Yes.
Well, I do want to hear some your reading, but I have this. You're just mentioning that brought something to my mind. I loved in your book the whole idea of the levels that Mike went through. First of all, it was all just revenge and it was against him. But the more he thought about it and the more experience in life he had, he began to open up more about himself and how he also, in the final level, how he had covered up something, a secret that he kept for so long. So I just think that kind of fits in with the Grand Canyon. You know, growth and development, it's instead of it's their fault, we bring it back to ourselves and we can see our own road in it. Anyway, sorry to interrupt, but I thought it was connected. I would like to hear you read something, please.
Sure. I'm going to read the beginning of chapter 14. Now, on the assumption that perhaps not everybody who's joined us has read the novel, I'll offer some context, but I'll also say that this does not offer a major spoiler, although I suppose there could be a little bit of one in here. This is taking place in a remote area of Montana, where the main character, Mike, and a number of other young men have been sent to participate in this therapeutic wilderness recovery program led by a clinical psychologist named Liz Crane and her husband, both of whom are former law enforcement officers and military vets. The conversation that figures in this scene that I'll read is between Mike, who is a 17-year-old who has lost his father and his brother recently, and engaged in an act of violence at school that got him into this situation, speaking with Liz Crane. And Liz is very subtly talking with Mike about some of the events that occurred in the aftermath of this loss of his brother, and alluding to some things, and very gently and subtly inviting Mike to become more forthcoming, both with her and with himself, about some of those emotions and those feelings. So it's a surfacing, as you spoke, of the emotional, the interior, and the emotional landscape. So I'll go ahead and read that. So if you have your book, if you're following along, this is the beginning of chapter 14, which is on pages 121 to 125. It was Mike's turn to do laundry. It took a long time, and his hands were raw from scrubbing against the old-fashioned washboards. The soap residue made his arms itchy in the hot sun as he hung dripping clothes on the line strung between trees across the sunny open bank. Finally, after clipping the last pair of pants to the line, he stretched aching shoulders, took off his shirt, and sat on the ground. It was a quiet afternoon, and he could hear the breeze on the water. The others were already back at the bunkhouse, cleaning up before dinner. Mike looked out across the lake, absently toying with his dad's cross. He lay on the ground, propping his head against a tree root, looking up at the swaying branches. Here in the shade, cool breeze dried his sweat. He heard someone coming and hunched up on his elbows to see Liz. He started to get up. No need to get up, Mike. He brushed dirt from his back and elbows and reached for his shirt. Sorry, I should get... Relax, she said, and sat down on a rock a few feet away. Nice out here in the shade. Yeah, it is. He leaned back up against the tree and threw the t-shirt back on the grass. What's up? I saw you down here alone. Thought maybe we could chat a little. Okay. About what? He wondered. Liz looked out over the lake, squinting at the glare. You know, Mike, I've worked with a lot of people in grief counseling over the years, and I have to say, I'm impressed by you. She turned to him, her eyebrows raised. Impressed? Why? You don't seem bitter. Mike almost laughed. Lady, he thought, you have no idea. Well, he said through a smile, I don't know if that's really true. She nodded. I know what you did, but I'm not talking about that, Mike. I'm talking about your affect. My affect? The way you talk to people, carry yourself. You don't strike me as a particularly bitter kid. Mike looked at the ground. Well, I guess you're seeing like the calm after the storm. Makes sense. She looked back out across the water. Still, that's a heck of a lot to go through as a teenager. First your dad and then your brother. Hardly seems fair. This time Mike did laugh out loud. I gave up on fair a long time ago. Yeah? Mike nodded. Yeah, I just thought of something. Math class, freshman year, our teacher was talking to us about probability. I was only half paying attention, but then somebody started talking about low probability stuff like lightning strikes or shark attacks. Anyway, the teacher started going off about how people worry about low probability events a lot more than high probability ones. Liz nodded, like worrying more about a plane crash than a car crash. Mike sat up further. Right. He was saying people worry about stuff that's more sensational. Like there's tons of car accidents every day and hardly any plane crashes. Sure, said Liz. Although, to be fair, there are a lot more cars on the road than there are planes in the air. And when a plane does crash, most of the people on it don't survive. But a lot of people survive car crashes. She tilted her head, looking right at him. I mean, you did, right? Mike hesitated, glancing quickly at her and then back out toward the water. Yeah, I guess that's true. Anyway, one of the guys says something about going on vacation and being scared of shark attacks, and the teacher said that he was a lot more likely to die of a heart attack than a shark attack. Morbid teacher, Liz chuckled, but yeah, that's true. Sure it is, except the thing is, he was new that year, this teacher, and he didn't know that my dad died of a heart attack. So he's up there drawing diagrams and graphs and stuff, really having a field day with it, comparing the probability of a man dying from a heart attack to the chances of getting killed by a shark. One by one, all the other kids started to look at me. I'll bet, said Liz, a sympathetic smile on her face. So what happened? Nothing. I can tell you, I thought a lot about probability that night. Anyway, like I said, I gave up on fair. Can't blame you. Right, because what's the probability of losing your dad and your brother in the space of 3.5 years? Liz gave him a serious look. I don't know, Mike. Yeah, me neither. They were silent for a long moment. Liz's voice was quiet. But isn't that why you cut yourself, though? Because it was fair? Mike sat up, tensing his shoulders, and glared at her. What? Last night. She was looking right back at him. You said the hurt felt fair. He thought to himself, and here I thought we were just having a nice conversation. No, of course not. This is a session. Everything is a session. Mike's heart pounded. He could feel it in his temples, the pinpricks on his neck and face. It didn't feel cool anymore. Yeah, I said that. He rubbed a finger across the scar on his arm, then abruptly realized he was doing it and stopped. It's okay, Mike. I don't. He stood up, crossing his arms. He looked out at the water, then down at the ground. Get out of my head. I don't do it anymore. It's over. I just stopped. After the truck accident, right? He glanced back at her. Stop looking through me. Yeah, after that. The tears were coming now. Damn, stop. Don't cry. Don't you cry. He shuddered and sniffled. He wiped his nose with a quick swipe of his arm. It was just like it all stopped then because, cover story. It was like I realized all it takes is one little accident and I could have, and then my mom, she'd be like, I don't even know how it happened. I mean, I was just driving along and I must have been going faster than Mike. She gripped his arm, startling him. She was strong. She held him right where the scar was. Huh. He looked down at her hand and then up at her eyes. They had welled up too. Mike, it's okay. But I tried. Shh. She looked out over the water. It's okay, Michael. Scars are good. Scars are where we heal. Even stronger than we were before. She let go of his arm. He pulled his arm away quickly, then wiped his face again. He looked over his shoulder at the main cabin. The others were already there getting dinner ready. I should go get cleaned up for dinner. Yes, you should. Liz, could we just keep that part? Of course, Mike. That's only fair, right? She turned and walked toward the main cabin. He looked back out over the water, tracing the ridge on his arm, and remembered.
Wow. I can barely speak. I mean, I read this and I loved it, but hearing you speak it was even better. Thank you. Thank you for that. Have you done an audiobook?
No, but it might be in the works.
I think it should be.
Thank you.
It also should be a film. I have to add that too. Anyway, wow. No, it was very, very touching. So you can see, audience, why he was chosen, why this book is so, so important. I think it's really important for boys. Anyway, I want to get back to, you were a swimming coach and you've done outdoor stuff. Why did you pick the wilderness? You mentioned the Grand Canyon, but what is your relationship to nature?
Well, I had the privilege as a teenager and a younger guy in my 20s to travel a lot of the world and see some places that are pretty off the grid. I'd spent some time in India and in Nepal, in the Himalaya, in the Patagonia regions of Chile, out west, the American West, the highlands of Scotland. And what I have always found about going into the wilderness is that it puts us in a different place with regard to our interior lives. It, I think, separates us from our comfort zone to such an extent that it enables us to think things that we really couldn't think, or at least wouldn't think when we're in the course of our normal life. There's also something very humbling about being in the elements. And, it makes me think when we're out in the wilderness, when I'm on the side of a mountain or, trudging through some mud, very close to the earth, very close to the earth. And there's something that is very, very invigorating about that, but it's also, as I said, humbling. It makes me think of the word humble and humility, which, derives from humus, which means earth. And so there's something about being human and being of the earth and being humble that are all related. And our word for humility and for human derives from being of the earth and returning to the earth. And that's what we do, at least our bodies, when we die, right? Mm-hmm. So I think having to confront something that is bigger than us, something that is primeval, something over which we have no control, the weather on the side of a mountain or the heat of a desert, allows us to push ourselves, and that's good in a sort of challenging way. But it also shows us our limits, and it shows us that we can't dominate everything. And I think it invites us to a kind of openness. I can't recall an experience in the wilderness with other people during which I haven't engaged in deep conversation. And that's more likely to happen than it is at a coffee shop.
Mhm.
And so with regard to the, conceptually for the novel, the very idea of wilderness therapy is that there's something therapeutic intrinsically about the wilderness, and that it can also be used intentionally and programmatically as an element of, professional clinical therapeutic programming. And so that's sort of the relationship between the wilderness and my experience and the story that plays out in the novel.
Right. Well, our environment is definitely becoming a much more important topic these days. I know during COVID, I've been reading a lot more about trees and forest bathing, which is, used as therapy in Japan. And I remember too, a number of years ago, there was a program called Outward Bound.
Mm-hmm.
Is that still in existence?
It is.
Yeah.
There's any number of programs out there. Wilderness therapy is kind of the word fringe sounds wrong because it sounds like, the lunatic fringe, but
Right.
it is I guess a marginal, it's marginal in the world of adolescent therapy, but it's certainly there. There are a number of programs. If you were to Google small w, small t wilderness therapy, you would find a number of organizations in Colorado and Utah, for example, that are specifically oriented toward helping kids recover from substance abuse issues or trauma in their family life or whatever. But you'll also find all sorts of adventure education, gap year programs, for example. I trained with the National Outdoor Leadership School for a while as a wilderness EMT, and they do, phenomenal work all over the world. They take kids for a semester or an entire year to places that are pretty off the beaten path. And I think for some kids, they really thrive in that environment, and they discover a great deal about who they are and who they want to be in the midst of trying to find out what they want to do. And those are two very different prospects.
Right.
Who I am versus what I do. And our culture, I think sometimes for young people, it conflates those two things and it confuses those two things, so that kids are often inclined to think about who they are in terms of what they do or their professional career aspirations. And that can be very stressful for kids. So sometimes getting out in the wilderness is a chance to take a pause and an opportunity to quiet all of the noise and the progress in the midst of all of the becoming that they're doing, to just be. I think that's very powerful.
Right. This is getting a little off the topic, but what's the Camino project? That sounds like, is that something connected?
To some extent, yes. I won't spend a ton of time on this or get far from the book, but the Camino Institute is the brainchild of a colleague of mine and we wanted to afford people an opportunity to have an experience that involves travel off the beaten path and do a little bit of disconnecting to reconnect with what matters most in their lives. And so we bought a couple of acres of land in the rural Dominican Republic. It was really a hell of a time to start an international travel business. And so it certainly is on pause for a while. But we have a very close relationship with the community in the rural DR and some very good friends down there. And so we've built a small retreat center, and we offer programs that couple working with the community on community-led service projects like building bridges or fixing water systems or fixing up houses with a retreat experience, either for, call it like a family reunion with a purpose, or a corporate retreat that is of a different nature. So that's on pause for sure, but it emerges from this belief that we have, my business partner and I, that people are craving experiences that take them outside of their comfort zone, that immerse them in a challenging environment, that put them in touch with a really elemental experience and allow them to explore a landscape that daily life doesn't necessarily allow, all the while doing something that's good and of real benefit for people. I spoke to I spoke to one of our investors, explained to me as she was traveling with us and seeing where we were planning to build our campus. And she said, you know, in my line of work, she works in a very high profile environment, high pressure. She says, it's impossible for me to go on a vacation. You know, I can't sit on a beach. I'm too worried about what's happening and I can't relax. But she said, what we've done here over the past few days, where I've been able to invest myself in a community and its needs and direct myself into something that is others oriented, that's actually, ironically, the most relaxed I've been in years. So I think there's a desire and a craving for that kind of experience. And that's what Camino is about. Maybe it's a different form of wilderness therapy.
Okay. Huh. I thought it was just for Canisius boys. So I'm glad.
No, it's a
that
separate
for
company.
everybody.
No connection to the school.
Okay. I'm going to get back to the book. Do you want to read any more, or do you want me to ask a question about the book, or what?
I'd be interested in getting into some Q&A. I would be happy to read another excerpt.
Let's have some. Do we have any questions, Michaela?
No questions yet from the participants, so.
All right.
I have a question.
Come on, participants, let's get going.
I have a question for you, Paul, and it's in regards to the characters in your book. Are they based on anyone how did you develop those various characters and their personalities and their life experiences that are so different from one another yet alike?
It's a really good question. Thank you. They're not based on anyone in particular. I think that's a dangerous tack to take as an author, because it can land you in some hot water if a character resembles a real person too much. But what they are I think realistic amalgamations of so many different students and kids that I've worked with over the years. And the differences in personality were intentional to try to portray, as I said, that diversity and complexity that exists in the masculine persona, because there is, I don't think it's any secret that, culturally masculinity fits into a relatively narrow, if not definition, at least manifestation. And, we have John Wayne, and we have variations on John Wayne. And I think that there's a nuanced variation to masculinity. It is not to say that traditional masculine norms no longer apply, because they do. And if they all went away, people would notice and people would long for them, frankly. If you had an entire population of men who moved away from traditional masculine norms, people would probably say, well, geez, there's something missing, we kind of need that. However, at the same time, the opposite end of that, the other pendulum swing of that, is that very often traditional masculine norms have done a great disservice to the truth of the emotional complexity of boys and men. And that has had, I think it's done collateral damage both to men and boys themselves, but also the people in their lives and the people whom they love, because it both closes them off to people that they love, and it closes people they love off to them. So in my development of the characters of the boys, what I tried to access was that complexity, that diversity, but also to give credence to the very undeniable and very apparent mask that goes across the interior lives of boys in most cases. And Liz and Jim really have to work hard to draw that interior life out. And it's only going to come out under certain circumstances. These kids need to be flown to the far reaches of Montana. As my late grandmother would say, out where God lost his shoes. They really need to go out there to the mountains. And even then, the really deep stuff, it only comes out when it's dark and there's a campfire that everybody's sitting around and they don't have to make eye contact, and they can focus on messing with the heart of the fire as they speak. Mm-hmm. And then gradually over time, as trust builds, that stuff can come out. So, Mary, I feel like I've deviated a little bit from your question, but character development is largely, for me, it's guided by, yeah, I want to create individual characters who are interesting, but it's also an attempt to give credence and to do justice to that emotional complexity among different people, because they're not all the same, even though they're all teenage boys.
Can we talk a little bit about the antagonist?
Yeah, sure. I don't want to delve into spoilers. Again, I don't know how many folks have either read or not read it, but there's one particular boy named Liam who turns out to be, like all of them, more complex than is first apparent. And what's interesting about Liam, I think, is that there's clearly a traumatic past. And my attempt with Liam was to be subtle in the escalation of his antagonism. It was to be subtle in the revelatory process that he is behind some of the things that have happened, and only in the latter stages of the plot for the characters really to realize the depth of his, how do I put it? The depths of his darkness, because he's an extraordinarily dark character, but it doesn't seem like that for a while. And what I attempted to do, and I don't know if I succeeded because it's my book, so I don't know. But what I attempted to do was to keep the reader in a place of somewhat ambiguity with regard to determining his character. There are some sympathetic elements to his character. His backstory, as I said, is traumatic, as is all of the boys. But what I think differentiates Liam from the rest is that while the rest of them are gradually revealing themselves, are gradually loosening their grip on their interior lives, becoming more open to each other, experiencing more solidarity with one another, Liam, on the other hand, he remains pretty static. He doesn't tighten up, but he remains static. And I think what's unnerving about him, and he unnerved me a little bit, even though I made him up, he still scares me a little bit. What's unnerving about him is just how even-keeled he is, how static. I picture a face of somebody who doesn't blink. That can be really unnerving. I don't know. I once worked with someone who oddly never seemed to blink. And I couldn't figure out what it was that was disconcerting about talking to this person until I realized, oh yeah, they never blink. That's what it is. And Liam in that way is so caught up in maintaining his even keel, and he's so goal oriented that ain't nothing gonna touch him. You know, he has a plan. Clearly he's had a plan for a while on some level. And I think that's what makes him very frightening, because he is not open to being understood. He doesn't want to be understood. He has no desire for that.
When he lets you think you're about to understand him, or he is opening up a little bit, it's part of the bigger plan.
I think so. Yeah. It's and much of it has to do with desire. You know, the more you read, the more you realize that the other boys have, as most boys do, I think, as most people do, a strong desire to be understood. They want, once there is an establishment of trust, there's a desire to be self-revelatory. There's a desire to share some of their interior life, if only to say, like, hey, this is me, right? You see me? You know, is this okay? Am I okay? That affirmation that comes from that transparency, most kids want that. And these kids, even though they're hesitant and scared to do that, they do want it. They crave it. You can discern how much they crave it. He just doesn't. He doesn't crave it. Not at all. He doesn't want them anywhere near him. And that's, I think, what makes him a little bit maniacal and frightening. So that plays out in the end. But again, I don't want to offer too many spoilers.
Right. I know. I loved all the characters. The four boys, Taylor, Aiden, Liam, and Manny, besides Mike. You focus mostly on Mike. I'd love to hear more in the future, maybe, about the other boys. A little more, in depth about them and what happened to them. And because I think they all had very interesting stories, which you did bring out. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
We
I
do
like,
have oh, sorry, Mary.
no, go
Uh,
ahead.
we do have one question from Anne. She said, your reading brought me to tears. Was the main purpose of the book to help explain the depth of feeling of young men?
I don't know if it was the main purpose, but it was a purpose. And, part of it is I wanted to tell an adventure story. But I think the bigger purpose served in the course of that adventure story is to say that, yeah, there's a lot going on in the minds and hearts of everyone. And whether they're, young men, young women, old women, whoever they happen to be. And there's a great deal of complexity to every human person. What I think the culture, and I alluded to this before, I think our culture tends to be very reductive and simplistic and sometimes dismissive about that complexity applying to teenagers, to young men, more so than it does to women and girls. And that's a generalizing statement, but I think it's generally true. So yes, I wanted to try to convey that and do some, again, lend some credence to that and say, hey, these little creatures are more complicated than they might seem. They are motivated by more than, chasing whatever their sexual desires may be and playing video games and watching football. There is more to masculinity than just those things. And I think people know that. I don't mean to patronize all of society. I think people know that, and yet we somehow sit by and are kind of we're kind of okay with that being the cultural narrative, and I think that does a great disservice. And I even go so far as to say I think that can do some considerable damage to a number of young men, and we see that playing out. It does not take much detective work, in looking at statistics regarding depression and depression taken so far as suicide, to recognize that there truly is a crisis level that is apparent among the male adolescent and young adult male population, which is different. And it's not to say that it's more important, but it's different, and it's more acutely apparent than to some other aspects of the demographic. So yeah, I think that was a reason for writing. Yes.
There's something of an expectation, and I'm thinking about Mike, the main character, and his friend Eric, who kind of is in the book but isn't in the book, and their relationship, and almost a need on Mike's part to keep the relationship at that upper level and not to take that relationship, even though they love each other and they're best friends and they know they can count on one another. In his darkest moments, Mike did not want to share with Eric what he was thinking and feeling. He wanted to keep it on that surface level, that upper rim, if you will.
Right. And what kid doesn't really, because having those conversations, even with people that we love
Girls
and trust.
Girls are more apt to share on
Sure,
it.
right. And that's to my point, right? I think that, and when I said what kid doesn't, I guess I should say what boy would want to, right?
Yeah.
And some boys really do want to. I guess that's maybe I should rephrase that. I think they all want to, as long as they're not, sort of psychopaths like Liam, right? But I don't know that very many of them feel that they have cultural permission to do so. Because what does it take, for a teenage boy in 2020 to be, first of all, to develop an emotional vocabulary, and then secondarily to that, to use it openly. Well, the implications there are really quite problematic in so many ways for a boy, right? Because if it's well received, then he can be applauded as, the sensitive guy, the emotionally intelligent guy. And that's all well and good, but if it's not well received, or people don't like what he has to say, or if the things that he has to say are going to raise suspicions about him or imply, damaged goods, frankly, man, can he get crushed? He can really get crushed. And I will be some people might push back on what I'm about to say, but I think that society is more forgiving and allows more, there's a wider lane for girls and young women to do that than there is for boys and young men to do that. There is a little
I
bit
agree.
more, there's a wider shoulder on the side of the road, perhaps, and a little bit more of an understanding that says, you know, obviously there's so much going on, let me throw my arms around you. Whereas the cultural response to boys is often, dude, buck up, you know, get it together. And that's not fair. It's really not. And I've seen that play out, you know, over the years in many scenarios where, you know, you give boys credit. They make the efforts to ask for help. You know, people will say, well, you know, boys they don't ask for help. They often do. But even the response from well-intentioned parents and mentors and culture in general can be, well, to some extent, man, I'm glad you're being open. That's good. But you know what? It's been like 20 minutes now. You got your sob story out. Now it's time to like get to work. So can you just go do your math? And that sort of is the message, you know, and that's not to say that we want to develop a culture of, or a population of boys and young men who are coddled, you know, to a ridiculous degree. That's not what I'm implying is necessary. But I do think that when culture tends to discourage emotional transparency, it's not hard to do the math and understand why boys tend to withhold a lot more than girls do. And then we wonder why they self-destruct. Except that we don't wonder, do we? You know? And I guess that's the tricky irony of the whole thing.
Do you think it's changing at all though? I mean, I think all of a sudden it has been, you know, girls, because girls have been kept down for so long. But I think I've heard a lot lately in the last, I'd say 4 or 5 years about the situation of boys, you know? And I think your book, I really do think your book should be in all schools for boys and girls too, to see that. So.
Well, I appreciate that. I'd love to see my book there because that would be a lot of books sold. But I do think it's changed. Yes, Kate,
Yeah.
I do think it's changed, and I think there is considerably more dialogue going on, both on the micro and the macro level culturally, about giving credence to the interior lives of boys and young men. But I think it's overdue, and it needs to ramp up more quickly because we're seeing the statistics play out. You know, if you look at the gap between, if you look at the gender gap in terms of who's graduating from college, who's attending college to begin with, and then who's graduating, it is very, very rapidly becoming heavily female. And that isn't necessarily, that's not intrinsically a bad thing, but the decline of male involvement in those intellectual pursuits and those professional pursuits is indicative. I don't know what it's indicative of, but I can tell that it's indicative of something, and I'm not sure it's good. So I just think that, you know, generally it's a call to action for any of us who live with or work with or are related to or just concerned about boys and young men to be aware that, you know, it is a Grand Canyon. There is a lot of nuance there. And even though the implication might be, or the inclination might be to oversimplify or have reductive conclusions about why boys are doing what they're doing or what they're thinking, I think we owe them and we owe ourselves as a society a little bit more pause and a little bit more due diligence when it comes to understanding them. So that's part of my attempt with the book.
Good, great. And I think it works. Yeah. What about like in schools? Are they doing that? Like Canisius, for example, are they recognizing it and kind of moving in that direction?
Yeah, I think so. You know, I can only speak to a limited degree, you know, having worked in a couple of all boys schools, but I know that there are many efforts to, you know, to have retreat programs and to have mentoring programs that involve conversation. And I think there's good movement in that direction. And what I'd take an optimistic disposition toward it. You know, even though we have some scary statistics out there, I'd like to think that the more conversations like this take place, the more they will build upon each other, and we'll have an upward spiral rather than a downward one. Kids tend to, in my experience, boys tend to respond very well once they are put in a position where they have trust, where they have some relationships, and where they are encouraged, you know, to be open with each other and to talk about what's going on. They will latch on to that, but it's like a boulder that you have to get rolling. And once it gets rolling, I think there's a lot of desire to do that because they know what's going on.
Right.
If they're made to feel that it's okay to sometimes not be okay and to talk about that, that's a great relief, and they'll open up just as the boys in the story do.
Right. I want to ask you, I want to get back to your writing process. Really kept me riveted, and I read a lot of books, and I still remember about Boarding Pass. I still remember that book. I can't remember a lot about a lot of books I've read. So you do have a way of really getting, I don't know, how would you explain that?
Well, in terms of a writing process, I think different writers have different processes. You know, there's no one way to write a book, and I only know my way. What I can tell you is that for me, the seed of a book is planted with the image of a character. I picture characters first. I don't know, but I think through my study of literature and my, you know, just having read interviews with other authors, I think that some authors are considerably more formulaic than I am. And I don't say that's a bad thing. I think that there are those who are principally plot driven, and I have a respect for that because it's actually where I struggle. I can evoke characters, and I can emote, and I could write you a 25-page scene where a kid is looking at his reflection in a window pane with raindrops coming down and tell you what he's thinking, but there won't be a hell of a lot happening, you know, and an editor will say, well, you know what, this is all very beautiful and lyrical, but for God's sake, something needs to happen. Whereas there are authors who are really good at making things happen, and their editors need to say, well, this is great, but it reads like an action movie, and we don't care.
Right.
We don't care. So for me, I'm very much a character-driven writer, and the seed of a story will begin with, as I said, the image of a character and a feeling, you know, that a character's having. So for example, I can tell you that one of the first images in my mind with wilderness therapy was of a kid who became Mike, standing on the side of a mountain, looking at the scar on his arm, and feeling a tremendous sort of guilt and shame. And I didn't know what he was ashamed of or guilty about. But I knew that this kid had been through some incredible trauma. I knew that this kid had come pretty close to extinguishing his own life out of a sense of desolation and hopelessness. I knew that this kid had really been put through the ringer to an extent that no kid should, and that he was at an inflection point in life where he could either choose to give up or get on. But he needed a lot of help. That was the image. And then I think from there, you know, after there's a number of scenes that come into my mind, but they're not organized. I don't know how they construct a plot yet. So, you know, for Mike, it's that image, but then there's also the truck accident, which any reader will be able to figure out pretty quickly isn't really an accident. And then there's Mike on the mountaintop, you know, in this sort of pseudo wrestling match with Liam while there's a thunderstorm going on. But I don't have them organized. And where I need a professional editor is to come in and help me say the chronology of your narrative could best be served by presenting these scenes in this order. Because, you know, one of the interesting things about narrative structure is that, and I teach this when I talk to my kids in class. There's two chronologies. You know, there's a narrative chronology, and then there's like an actual chronology of events. And if you think about books you've read or movies that you've seen, it is pretty rare. In fact, it's extraordinarily rare to have a story where the narrative chronology matches the actual chronology of events. You know, how many movies can you think of where they begin with something that's happening at the end, and then it says, you know, 3 days earlier, and you get the backstory, or stories that are told in a series of flashbacks or compartmentalized flashbacks, even within flashbacks, which can get very confusing. But a good editor who has that very formulaic understanding of narrative structure, you know, the 5-act play, which is sort of Elizabethan in many ways. That's become our convention. We have Freytag's pyramid, you know, with the rising action and, you know, crisis and climax and falling action and hopefully resolution. Most good stories do follow those conventions. You know, some people will say, well, that's so conventional. It's like, well, yeah, but it's so conventional because it's a convention, because it's conventional. And that's because that's life. That's how life is. So yeah. And that's really how most stories are built. You can map them that way. But for me as a writer, I have trouble figuring out how to put these sort of evocative scenes in that order. So that's where leaning on a really good editor is important. And I had a fantastic editor with this book, a young woman who was an editor at Simon & Schuster for a number of years. And she became freelance. I'm independently published, right? So I contracted with her, and man, did she tear the thing apart, but not in a like, oh, this is terrible way. But what she did was she took the pieces and she totally rearranged them and said, try it like this, and rewrite it. You know, don't copy and paste. You can't do that. You have to rewrite it. So I did, and you know, like, all right, rewrote the thing, and she was right. You know, she has that grasp. So for me, it's character driven. For some writers, I think they are plot driven and they have that structure planned out better. It can come together either way, but it is a team effort between a writer and an editor. And sometimes I think editors don't get the appropriate credit. But any novel that you've read, it's gone through an editorial process, and it is probably, what do I know? But it is more than likely very different from what the writer wrote originally.
Okay,
I'd
interesting.
like to make a comment about the structure of the book. I really found it fascinating how it was both in the first person and in the third person at the same time. And I had to actually double check more than once to think about, how did he write this book? Because Mike is talking to us, talking to himself and talking to us, but then then we're talking about Mike. And I thought that just kept it so lively. I don't recall reading a book that was structured quite like that.
It's I'll give a nod to Stephen King, who, you know, there's mixed feelings about Stephen King, but I look at Stephen King. I mean, yes, he's a remarkable, you know, evocateur of horror, right? That's true. But what I admire about Stephen King is his character development is fascinating. I mean, it is remarkable how that guy can bring a character to life. And a technique that he uses, and many authors use this, is the use of the italicized text to portray interior thought, which is what is at work in wilderness therapy. So when, you know, as you say, it's written in the third person, as it is, yes, but it is also, it's third person limited, you know, so we really only see the interior. We only know what's going on in Mike's heart and mind, even though it's written in the third person about Mike, right? We don't get inside the head of anybody else. We hear them and we know what they are saying, but a mechanism for getting further inside the head and heart of a character is to have that interior monologue using the italics. Why do italics work? I don't know. They just do. There's something that signals the reader, maybe because it's become a convention, but it's very clear. It's actually hard to read out loud, right? You notice when I read that excerpt, I had to insert things like he thought, because, you know, if people are listening, they can't see the italics, so they don't know, and that can be confusing. So anyway, yeah, it is all one point of view, but that convention enables the introduction of a different level of first-person narrative.
I just want to make two comments too. While I was reading it too, I was thinking this is a modern version of Lord of the Flies in a way, although a lot easier to read for me. And I also was thinking of Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn. I was just thinking of, you know, all these little characters. I want to know more about Taylor. I want to, you know, I want to know more about Aiden and Manny. So yeah, interesting.
Well, there's an archetypal convention of the dueling character type, right? So with Huck and Tom, they're different in a lot of ways. And you know, when you mention that story, you can overlap that with Lord of the Flies, and you can think about Ralph and Jack, who are you know, very consequential characters in that story. I did some master's work on William Golding, specifically on Lord of the Flies. Lord of the Flies is a different story. Lord of the Flies, because you know, William Golding's story is pretty interesting. In fact, I'm going to start teaching it in the next 2 weeks with my freshmen. So I'm glad you brought it up. William Golding was a naval officer turned school teacher, and in interviews later in life, as he was speaking about, you know, writing the story. And I'm paraphrasing because I don't have this in front of me, but you know, he said something to the effect of, men at war are not that far removed from boys in the schoolyard. And what was interesting to me is that Golding wrote very sparsely, not in great quantity about his war experience, but he was a deck officer on a ship. I can't recall which type, if it was a destroyer or whatever, but he was privy to the landing at Normandy. He could see it through his binoculars. He wasn't part of the landing, but he was on it. He was a deck officer. And he was witness to the carnage that happened on the beach that, you know, many of us think of Saving Private Ryan, right? That level of carnage and just extermination of human life very rapidly. He was privy to that, and it changed him. And when he wrote later on in Lord of the Flies in 1956 about the darkness of a man's heart, he did not believe, and he was a little bit cynical, you know, he did not believe that there was anything totally separate from the spontaneous cruelty that he could observe among schoolboys and what he saw play out on the beaches of France. And so I think for Golding's book, he took a group of pre-adolescent boys, because I believe he really wanted to make the point that there is this capacity for great cruelty. There's this capacity for horrific action, but there's also the capacity for high compassion. There's the capacity for great good, and it's a wrestling match, and it plays out whether we are 7 or 70. It's the same question, and there's forces pushing in both directions. I find that a fascinating story. I've had a number of people say, you know, your book made me think of Lord of the Flies. You know, of course, because it's a group of boys that sort of become abandoned in the wilderness and they've got to fend for themselves, and that's a bit of a trope. But you know, sometimes tropes are tropes because they work really well, and they've proven themselves, and people keep coming back for more. So it's like, all right, maybe because there's some truth to that. So yeah, certainly that was an influential work for me. So I'm glad you brought it up.
I see there's a question or something on chat. Is there?
Let me look. So this one's from Miriam. She says, what do parents need or lack to help their children deal with the complexity? And I think this was going back towards something we were talking about a little bit ago about like upbringings of young boys and those emotions. Okay.
Well, I'm not I always say I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist or a counselor with a capital C. So I like to preface my comment by saying, you know, I can offer my perspective on it. I think that with boys, there is a tendency in general to be reductive about what's going on, and to assume that there's not complexity to it. And so I guess to the question, I would say one of the things we can do is we can train ourselves to not assume that it is as simple as we might think it is. But the caveat that I would throw on that is to say, remember that sometimes it is really simple. You know, sometimes it's just, he just got a bad grade on his test, or he just didn't make the baseball team. And that's all there is to it. And he's upset, and let him be upset. It doesn't mean, you know, that it doesn't need to be like a psychological battery going on every time the kid sheds a tear. But with that caveat offered, again, I'll swing back in the other direction. I do think that since the cultural norm is to encourage boys to buck up and move on, which is valuable in some cases. And sometimes we do just need to buck up and move on, because that's life, right? For everybody, boy, girl, whoever. I think there's an inclination to take more time and to allow that to play out more for a young girl, for example, than there is for a boy. And I suppose one of the things that parents can do also, well, here's something. I think that frustration sometimes it manifests very, very predictably in boys in anger. Anger is a very accessible emotion. First of all, it comes on quickly. Secondly, it's very obvious. Like, some emotions aren't so obvious. Anger is pretty obvious. I mean, it's just like physical signs, huh? But it's also, you know, in a developing adolescent brain without a prefrontal cortex all the way there, it's so accessible, and it's going to come on so strong that it's a pretty good indicator sometimes that there's more going on. But the trick, I think, well, not the trick, I don't like to use the word trick, the complexity comes in, or the challenge comes in, where the anger is such a turnoff to trying to work with a kid, because it's like, oh, if you're just going to be angry, obviously you don't want to talk. And it's like, no, you got it totally wrong. He does want to talk. His number one, probably doesn't know how to. Number two, society's telling him not to. And number three, the anger has to process first. So the anger is not like a sign that says, go away, shut up, I don't want to have anything to do with you. The anger is like, there's this, you know, testosterone driven hurricane going on that I don't know how to handle at age 13 or 16 or 17 or 30. And I need some time to vent that. But don't let that don't let that be a signal that everything just needs to shut down. And I think that's a big ask for parents. It's a big ask. And I can think of, I'm a parent of I have an 8-year-old, you know, and I see this starting to happen with him, and he is pre-adolescent, but there are the beginnings of those little squirts of hormones going on. And, you know, he will erupt in anger where his sister will not erupt in anger. She will erupt in tears, and she'll come running. He will slam something and run away. It's like textbook, you know, difference. And oftentimes my instinct is, well, if that's how you're going to be, then go hide in the corner, you know? And I'm like, I'd like to think I know a little bit about this stuff, and I do that, right? So I think I'm sympathetic, because I think parents have trouble seeing past that immediate anger response with boys and then coming back to it once the dust has settled, because it can be such a turnoff, you know?
I know that in the museum, and we, pre-COVID days, when we toured a lot of kids, and some kids were kids that had emotional problems, boys had a great deal of difficulty talking in front of works of art. But boy, you get them into the classroom and you put a pencil in their hand and give them an assignment, and they just open up and share all sorts of things. They're just better if they're doing something. And I very much thought of that when I thought about how they were cleaning and cooking and doing laundry and talking at the same time.
And the labor piece is very important. You know, the activity. There's a pretty substantial body of clinical research that, again, I'm not an expert in, but I'm privy to having read about, that suggests that in almost any clinical setting with a boy, you're going to have a more productive conversation if some sort of movement or purposeful action is taking place simultaneous, even if it's going for a walk as opposed to sitting across from somebody on a couch or throwing a ball back and forth. Michael Gurian, who is a pretty high profile expert in gender differences in brain development, wrote a kind endorsement of my book. And I know that one of his big pushes is to suggest that when you're working with boys, try to activate that sort of kinesthetic aspect of the brain. If you throw a ball back and forth with a boy while you're talking with him, not only it's not only a psychological kind of distraction, but it actually is, and I don't claim to understand the science, but is firing different neurons that are going to sort of ramp up the way the brain is performing, even though it's unrelated. So I think your point about action is very important, Marian. That might be something to the question that we received about reaching boys. It's like, if you want to talk to a boy about something that has happened or something he's got going on, don't sit down. Don't sit down at the table and say, let's talk. Because it's like, no, let's go for a walk. Let's go for a hike. Let's weed the garden. Let's demo that old thing in the garage. That's when we'll talk, at least in my experience.
Another point I'd like you to talk about is that dynamic of that family that kept shrinking. And when she lost her husband, the mother was still very capable of keeping things together. But when she lost the son, then it was just a little bit too much for her. However, when Michael went and learned that he was strong and he could make a difference and he could be part of a system where they helped one another, that was then reflected in how he and his mother worked together and helped one another, which I thought was just very interesting. So it's back to your process, how you got there.
I'm glad you picked up on that. Mike's mom she's a fascinating character. I'd hesitate to call her a secondary character. She doesn't appear very much in the book relative to the others, but she is extraordinarily instrumental in how the story plays out on a bookend level. Because you're right, at the beginning, we have very much this just desolated woman. I mean, she's just been demolished, and there's no other way to put it. Losing a husband and then losing a child, which I can't relate to. I don't know how anybody could relate to those things without having been through them. And the artistic recreation of a narrative, it's an attempt to imagine what those things would be like. As I can tell you, in fact, I had somebody come up to me in a coffee shop once and ask me if I was okay, because I was in tears as I was writing a certain section where I was imagining what it would be like to lose a son or a daughter. And I lost it. I was falling apart. And it's part of what helped me write the book, frankly. Tears are, a magnificent ingredient when it comes to plot structure. But to have her be so decimated at the beginning and then see how obviously she has gone through her own adult grieving process in the backdrop, while we've been following Mike up into the mountains, and we're seeing the adolescent process play out, and we're seeing this this mirror image of Mike's mother in Liz in so many ways. Those two characters are mirror images. Liz lost her son, and Liz ends up losing her husband, right? So there's an obvious parallel there, and I don't think you can miss that. While we see that going on, clearly Mike's mom, and we're all adults on this panel, I think, she's going through obviously a very different grieving process. And then when they reconnect at the end, they've both been radically transformed by the time that's passed. Mike with the help of somebody else and through professional counseling and an obviously unexpected traumatic event. His mother, who knows? Was she undergoing counseling? Probably. I don't know. I didn't write that in because it wasn't central to the story. But the ability for them to reconnect at the end is so important because they obviously can recognize in each other that they have the solidarity of having survived this trauma together. And the restart out west, I think that was a critical plot point for me, because originally I thought, well, I'll have them just sort of like, I'll have the closing scene be in the backyard near the treehouse, you know, back in the town of Lawson, and it'll end with them, you know, maybe both just looking at the treehouse, and you know, we could presume that their life just sort of is a slow healing process from there. But I thought, no, you know, I would think that after a trauma of that extent, after something that is so fundamentally heart-shattering that they have had, that there would be a desire for a geographic reset in something that, you know, they had to go to the other side of the country in the clear air and the sunshine of Sedona, Arizona, to really have that reset. But I would like to think that the story is a testament to hope, in the sense that, you know, even after remarkable trauma, people can start over, people can reset, and it's not a matter of forgetting what's happened, but that there is always this opportunity for redemption, as hard as it may be to get there.
Michaela,
Any
any
other
more questions from our audience?
There are no more questions from our participants. So,
Well, we invite everyone, if you have a question, now is a good time to ask.
And while they're asking, could you tell us a little bit about Blue Doors? Is it just a like historical description, or is it stories, or?
It's a little bit of both, I guess. I was commissioned to write the sesquicentennial history of the school. And as you might know, Canisius High School and Canisius College share origins, and they were essentially the same organization until about 1912. And then they separated, and the story is interesting because it's a Buffalo story. And, you know, on one level, I think if somebody who didn't have any connection to the schools were to pick it up, you know, they'd probably say, well, this is interesting, but, you know, I can't really connect with this. But on the other hand, the institution, both the college and the high school, they're so embedded in the history of Western New York and Buffalo, that where the story sort of, it lays out a trajectory between, you know, just prior to the Civil War to 2020, in terms of how the schools have experienced, you know, all of those changes, and how a school, you know, even if it's not Canisius High School, how a school sort of experiences all of the ups and downs and societal changes and things going on. Some of the most fascinating aspects of that story for me, you know, certainly are about Canisius, but they're also just about the perspectives of people at various war times. And one of the things that became apparent to me was that, you know, when World War II was going on, for example, and you had a high school where the boys who are, you know, in high school in the late 1930s and the early 1940s, you know, were certainly about to be plunged into this war, if not directly on the front lines, certainly being mixed up in it on some level. And then, you know, subsequent to that, Korea and Vietnam and the Gulf War, et cetera. Those wartime awarenesses on the part of the faculty and the administrators of the school are very different than the wartime awareness of the students. And it struck me, I was surprised to read just how, I don't know if insulated is the right word, but life went on, and high school kids did high school things, even as they saw what was looming on the horizon in a totalitarian, you know, threat to Europe and the entire world. But the adults were very keenly concerned and aware, and at times fearful and at times hopeful about the world that their students were entering into. And of course, I can relate to that as a teacher and as a parent, but I was fascinated by how life really does kind of keep going on. And that becomes very prescient now, you know, because obviously there's a heck of a lot going on right now. And in some ways, you know, it feels like the world is stopping, but in so many ways, life is just finding a way and going on. And, you know, we're trying to tackle things one thing at a time. So yeah, it's a neat story. I think it has more, obvious appeal for graduates of those institutions. But I like it because it's a Buffalo story too.
So we have a comment from Joanne. She's like, not a question, a comment. She says, I love your books and learn from them. My hope is that someday you will be a headmaster. How lucky are the boys you teach? From Joni.
Well, that's very kind, Joni. I like my summers off, and I think my family does too. So that's the only thing standing in the way. I like having the time to do the writing and those kinds of things. Although, school leadership is something that interests me, and I find that there's a lot of different forms of leadership. There's formal and informal leadership in schools, and there's all kinds of ways that can be broached. But I appreciate the vote of confidence.
So what's next? What's next?
I'm working on a book that is a collection of essays and reflections about adolescence and about growing up through young adulthood. It is predictably, I guess, oriented toward young men, and it's aimed at offering some blunt sort of thoughts and some encouragement, and saying some things that I've figured out, I think, through some challenges, and inviting a more hopeful disposition among a lot of young guys who I think are not. So that's sort of it's been a back burner project. It's something I've been working on slowly over the past few years. I do want to dive into another work of fiction, but I haven't felt that spark yet. And Wilderness Therapy has only been out in the world for a little while, since May. I had hoped for an opportunity to launch it with more fanfare, et cetera. But I was going to hold on to it, until like people could do more things, and it could do a big book launch and all that kind of stuff. But I thought, it's kind of silly. I want the book to be out there. People need something to read. I think it's got a good message for those of us who are feeling maybe a little bit trapped and limited and not so hopeful right now. So I thought I'd put it out there. But yeah, I haven't geared up for the next one yet. But
okay, one last question. How old is your daughter?
My daughter is 6.
6. Okay. Well,
Yeah.
You're going to have a whole new thing to write about.
Exactly.
Because with brothers growing up, working with boys, and having 2 sons,
Right.
get ready.
It's it's funny. My wife comes from a family of sisters, and I come from a family of brothers, and we often will, if not directly, indirectly reference that in terms of our interpretations of the world.
Right.
So yeah, it's very exciting working with all of them, and I'm excited to see who they become.
If you've not read the book, I encourage you to do so. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I really want to thank you tonight, Paul, for coming in and sharing your book with us. And I want to thank Kate for the wonderful job you did facilitating. It's either your 4th or 5th. Now I'm lost track. And Michaela, thank you. And thank all of you for joining us this evening. I hope you'll come back on November 5th when we will have someone zooming in from Paris, France. She wrote the book, The Seine, the River That Made Paris, and her name is Elaine Scolino. I hope I'm saying that correctly. She's a New York Times foreign correspondent and has agreed to share her newly launched book with us. So thank you again, Paul. I know we'll have you back for your next book, whenever that might be. And good night, everybody. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.